Hey everyone.
Good evening.
Hey Mel. Again,
Hello.
Mel Lowry's here with us, everyone, this evening.
Hello. Happy Tuesday.
Happy Tuesday to you. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. I think I'm doing better because I have not been around all this news conversation going on. But yeah.
Yes.
I
Yes.
think I do.
Well, it's good to see you. And yeah, speaking of the news, we're going to acknowledge again another murder by police, our sibling Dante Wright, and we're going to say his name and hold his family in our prayers, and then also recommit to dismantling racism and white supremacy, and our prayers need to be backed by action. And so to acknowledge that before we begin our discussion tonight.
Which again is another timely discussion.
Yes.
This is like the second time like a breaking or third time a breaking thing has happened that has aligned with a lot of the conversation on the show. So
yeah.
Good to be here.
It's good to see you. And tonight we are going to be talking about a new book called Race in America, Christians Respond to the Crisis. And we're going to have the guests that were a part of this book that was kind of a collaboration from a lot of contributors. And so we are going to go ahead and welcome our wonderful guest to the show. And Laura and Amaury are here with us. And we are so glad you are here. Being with us this evening, and we'll just start by inviting you to introduce yourself. So we'll start with Laura.
Thanks so much for having me. My name is Laura Mariko Cheifetz. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm an ordained teaching elder in Middle Tennessee Presbytery. I'm the co-editor of this very exciting book, Race in America, one of the co-editors. And right now I'm working at Vanderbilt Divinity School as the assistant dean of admissions. So I live in Nashville, Tennessee with my spouse and our little rescues. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here.
It's good to be here. My name is Amaury Tañón-Santos. My pronouns are L, he, and him. I serve the Schenectady Community Ministries as its executive director, and I'm a minister member of Albany Presbytery and live in Albany Presbytery. And it's really good it was fun to have that moment of reflection in writing a chapter on colonization, racism, and assimilation, and to be in this conversation.
Awesome. Thanks for being here. And we're going to first show the book cover for everyone to see. That's what it looks like. If you want to go out and purchase the book, Race in America, Christians Respond to the Crisis. That is the book cover, and that is what it looks like, just so you know. So we'll show that for a little bit. There we go.
And it's available on all platforms, Laura?
Get it anywhere you get books.
Perfect. So maybe a good place to start is, and we obviously know why, but just to hear it from y'all, why this book? Why is this book needed in this moment? And the thinking behind putting this book out.
Sure. So this initially started as a project in 2008 by the other co-editor, David Maxwell. He came and talked to a group of folks at McCormick Theological Seminary and then talked to folks at some other theological institutions about doing a study packet for Christians to use in congregational settings. So they were meant to be like your Christian Ed series, right? On a Sunday morning or a Wednesday evening. And so it started out as this packet on the Thoughtful Christian. And then in 2014, 2015, a lot was happening still, and it needed an update. But then he thought, this would be great as a book to put out for folks. And then we can use that as an opportunity to also update some of the information, add some new content. This was, we wanted to think about what things were like after Obama. Because this had been written just as the initial packet had been written, just as Obama had been elected. And so it felt like we were in a very different era. And so that book came out in 2016, I believe. And then obviously Trump happened. And so many other things happened. The previous book did not include anything about Black Lives Matter because it was just being written as things were starting to happen. And now we're just in a really different space in terms of race and racism in the US. And so they approached me, one of the editors, Bob Ratcliffe, approached me and asked if I would be willing to co-edit and basically update it, streamline some chapters, write some new chapters, and then also locate folks who could write new content. To make sure that we're always putting out relevant resources. And it's meant for Christian congregations, but individuals, I think, can also read it. It's what I would call, it's very digestible. So it's meant to be very user-friendly for people who may be a little bit newer to some of these concepts and conversations, but it's also grounded in some really sophisticated racial analysis, power analysis, intersectional work, understandings of history that are not gentle, I guess. So you can clearly see in some of the content, we want to make it accessible, but it is not dumbed down at all. So that was part of the purpose of bringing in some of the new authors as well of chapters.
The one other thing that I would add to that, I think would be relevant to this conversation, is that as Laura approached me, and I'm sure approached other colleagues that were writing the book, there is clearly an aim to make this book available to the majority of the PCUSA and other mainline Christians, who are mostly white. But one of the things that I enjoyed in putting my chapter together, in putting some of the thoughts on colonization and assimilation together, but also in reading the book and going back to it, is that it also helps to create to garner the power of the intersectionalities of power and privilege and racism and other things, and begin creating solidarity amongst marginalized peoples. Right. I think the book is a great example not only of the stories that individually these communities share, but the connections among them. Right. And then fostering solidarity in the plight against racism and white supremacy.
So I want to ask, because you brought up your chapter colonization. So what are some of the, crises, and who are some of the other authors that have contributed to this? What is the crisis in terms of race that you guys are responding to in this book?
So I definitely want Amaury to talk more about his chapter because it's awesome. It's so interesting, and I'm really happy that he agreed to write it. When I was talking with Bob, we were like, okay, what are the things that this book definitely does not cover already? And it needs to be updated to reflect. So Black Lives Matter, obviously. And I was like, look, honestly, that needs its own chapter because it deserves multiple books, and there are multiple great books out there about the various movements and the histories, but I was like, it needs its own chapter. And the way in which immigration was already really dysfunctional under Obama, differently dysfunctional than under W, because W was kind of inept when it came to immigration. And unfortunately, Obama was very efficient and everything ran really well, which then meant that more people were getting deported and locked up in prison camps, basically. And so that was already bad. But then Trump really upped the ante in terms of what we would consider to be bad, in terms of bad immigration policy, racist atmospheres around migration. and criminalization and just the stigma against it, and even messing with DACA the way that he did, and then singling out a group of religious people in particular for negative impacts on their immigration statuses. So there was just so much there that I was like, obviously we should talk about this. And I think that the Trump reaction to Maria, and the way that FEMA and the Trump administration really botched the recovery from Maria really laid bare for more of the population to get a better sense of what our colonial relationship is like and what it's not like, with, in particular, Puerto Rico. But of course, that goes for several of the other colonies that the U.S. holds. And then, of course, the internet is a very different thing now. So Facebook was already like a hot mess, right? We already knew that social media and promulgating false information was bad. But again, the Trump era really escalated all of that, and Russia's success in rigging the election the first time around really just, I was like, we need more information on that. And because the Trump era's tenor was so different, that's why I ended up contributing a whole chapter on Trumpism, because it was such a distinct departure. It was like, oh, we're going back to saying all the quiet parts out loud, first of all. And everything was like racism and xenophobia on steroids, with Stephen Miller being in the White House and writing a lot of policy. So that's a little bit about some of the different things that we wanted to include. And I was like, ooh, who's a good person to talk about immigration, criminalization, colonialism, occupation? Amaury. And luckily he said yes.
And part of the complicated part of that, when Laura was saying, is like, I don't have, I don't have the time or the space to write about each one of those things, right? In a way that would do it justice. And of course, Laura said, we're just creating spaces to start conversations and people to actually, get their toes into the water of actually talking about it. It's like, okay, I'll try. And then what came out was this chapter that I think is a very long ramble about, so this is how everything is connected. So Pope so-and-so, right, in the late 1400s and early 1500s started doing all these things, right, that led to Protestants in the northern and western parts of Europe to start thinking about this way, that led us to this thing, right? So the connection, right, between the doctrine of discovery, which our church has repudiated at the more recently, with manifest destiny, with American imperialism, with the way that everything resulted in Maria, that not only affected Puerto Rico as a U.S. territory, it also affected the U.S. Virgin Islands, which we don't talk about, and certainly all other islands in the Antilles. It's all connected, right? So the main aim of that chapter is to create that connection, right, between Western European endeavors that began in Africa, right, in trying to find a route to India, right, to develop some trade, how that pursuit across Africa created colonies throughout the western parts of Africa that led to the eventual enslavement of Africans, that led to the transatlantic slave trade, that led to all the issues that we know on the ways the peoples of African descent are still dealt with in the United States and all throughout the Americas. Is all connected, right? And that's why I go back that one of the gifts of this book that may not be the main intention, but I think it's going to start creating it, is that solidarity will be built once we realize that the reason peoples of African descent in the Americas are treated the way they are, peoples who are indigenous in the Americas are treated the way they are all connected and part of one core project. And that is white supremacy, that from the beginning and at its core had a connection to the church giving it relevancy and an excuse to exist based on scripture, based on theology, seeking to expand not Christianity, but a very white, very Western European way of it. That's how all this happened, and that's how we landed here. So there's a lot more connection, say, with Laura's Japanese and Jewish background and my Puerto Rican Antillean self, than simply Laura and Amaury as two individuals might realize themselves. But once we start going deeper into that, we realize they have much more in common and much more to struggle with. And then our struggle will be stronger by realizing those connections.
And I wonder, and yeah, and the work that I've done with Unbound and some of this work is that we hope that we can make those connections, because I know some of the reasons, but there is a lot of compartmentalization in a lot of history, in our psyches, and how we emotionally process things. And I wonder how, projects like this, but also other ways, because as Presbyterians, and this is kind of a stereotype we all need to work out, but we always think we can read ourselves and think ourselves out of things. And how do we really kind of make those connections mentally, but also go past into making it, how do we make our connections with empathy and action? And so I wonder what y'all think about that, because I do know so many people who can't make those connections because of I don't know what reasons, but I wonder about that too. How do we both make it intellectually, and then how do we make it empathetically and spiritually, as people of faith?
Yeah, I always think about this work as needing to have multiple on-ramps. So I too find it a little frustrating that some people are like, First Instinct is a book group. On the other hand, I've had the advantage of the lived experience, parents who understood how white supremacy operates in the US and were able to kind of help raise me in that. And I've read a ton already. So I just feel like not everyone has that kind of opportunity. I have told many a white person that they are really not good at talking about race because their families and their educations didn't prepare them. And I was prepared to talk about it out of life and necessity, because there's no other way to make sense of my experience and my growing up otherwise. And I have parents who talked about it as well. So I think having yet another book is just providing another on-ramp, because at some point, everyone's going to have an on-ramp that clicks for them, and it's going to be really different. And I have seen people try to do work, and I think this is happening a lot now, where a lot of younger people are trying to do anti-racism work without having a really great grasp of, for instance, some of our shared histories, some of the solidarity work that some of our different ethnic and racial groups have done together, because they didn't learn it in school. And when are they going to have time to read it? And I think that not really having a good grasp of how we got here can lead to some really messed up and unsustainable organizing to help end it. So, and I think like some people, they just check out if they can't make those connections, and then they go and they don't bother to vote, or they don't realize the impact of something that they say because they haven't learned about it yet. So I think in some ways, this is just like, here's another on-ramp, right? And what I do like about the book, there's a couple of chapters I did not touch a whole lot. And one of them is specifically for white people, and it's because I'm not white. And the person who wrote that particular chapter is white and did honestly a really good job, I thought, already in providing some very concrete things that people can do. And also knowing that if you have the right on-ramp, right, and it clicks for people, then they're going to be motivated to go out and learn more and seek out relationship and make mistakes and figure out what's the doing of all of this. Beyond just the learning. We did make one style choice, which was to Kim Jackson, who wrote the Black Lives Matter chapters. All of these are anonymous for the most part. We tried to kind of streamline voice and all of that so that it flows. But Kim's is clearly written by Kim in the first person, because she did some movement chaplaincy when in Ferguson and elsewhere, as Black Lives Matter as a movement was really starting up in response to the murders of Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown. And because she had really specific experiences as herself, then we kind of left the I in that chapter, but that's the only chapter where that really exists. And it's because of the, like, some of it is just being true to her experience, but also allowing some of that empathy as well, going beyond just the very factual and allowing the narrative.
I didn't know if you had anything to say, Amaury. I want to be honest and say that I saw the police walk behind you and my heart jumped for a moment. Just want to
I
kind of
appreciate that, and the
acknowledge
reason that why nothing happened is because my wife was in the car right there, right up, and it was getting fixed, and now they're gone. And but I think I'm good.
So
Yes.
Amaury is out near a federal building, so it wouldn't be
The
a
Leo
live.
O'Brien building right here.
So it wouldn't be a Just Talk Live if
the world.
something wasn't actually live. But in today's world, I
appreciate that. I appreciate that.
If it was Lee, sorry, Lee, I'd be a little bit more at ease. But my response, and I keep hearing the word connection, and I know we like to call ourselves a connectional church. And for those who did not go to seminary and who are thinking about it, we also like to talk about living in the tension of things. A part of my response is, or question, kind of snarkiness is, why isn't this a one-page, do what Jesus did book? Like, what about where we are or where we've come makes it so that as Christians, we need a book to help us know how to respond to basic biblical tenets. What about, how is the theology written in or expressed, I guess, would be a good question in this book to help Christians really understand that there is a biblical Christian response and not just me as human, I guess. I don't know, but you know what I'm saying.
So my initial thought to that is to accuse Laura of being a Jesus follower. In that, the way the book got together was not only trying to seek people that were knowledgeable or experts. I would not call myself an expert on colonization, but being a colonial subject gives me some perspective about it. And I'm a historian, so maybe also that comes to bear a little bit in the book. But it was also bringing people that were intimately connected to that, right? Not simply through academic work, but through lived experiences. And I think that's exactly what Jesus did, right? We can debate all that we want about, Jesus being fully God, and if Jesus was fully God, then he was also all-knowing and all the things, right? But the dude that walked on Palestine in the first century didn't, or acted as if he didn't know everything, and he needed people around him to constantly bring him back to perspective, right? The collection of dudes he surrounded himself with and called disciples, right, where 12 of the most diverse contextually people he could find, the group of women that he surrounded himself by, where a group of women of multiple at the context, that he could surround himself by, the encounters he either walked into or facilitated, all spoke to the way in which Jesus needed to place himself in perspective to the redemptive work he was modeling, right? So much so that in the encounter of Jesus, for instance, with the Syrophoenician woman, right? There's a commentary out there that says that the Christ in that story wasn't Jesus, but the Syrophoenician woman herself, calling her a dog, the woman insisting, and Jesus having to recognize it is because of your word, by which I might read insistence, right, that this will get done, right? That changed Jesus' perspective, right? So what I think Laura and the authors sought to do in this book was bring not simply knowledge, but experience to bear. And that leads me a little bit back to a comment that Lee was saying, mentioning compartmentalization. I think in multiple chapters, but definitely the chapter on colonization, I make the point, not as I'm going to make it now, but compartmentalization is a tool of white supremacy, right? The creating of categories, the racializing over the ethnic groups, over the social positioning at the groups and everything, is a tool for white supremacy to stay on top and create what are in fact artificial divisions, right? And the way the colonial endeavor of the United States, together with Western European the colonization, was exactly in this divide and conquer narrative, right? Where instead of allowing the Americas to become this collective project of freedom for the sake of the poor and the marginalized, which is a constant threat in Spanish, in Portuguese, in French, and in multiple native languages, when a lot of these countries started standing up and against their Western powers then continued after independence of these countries to create narratives that actually divided these countries, right? So one of the authors that I commend to everybody listening, but that I go back often to, is Edward Glissant, the Martinican the author and philosopher. In his articulation of blackness, negritud, in Spanish and in French, as the core narrative of the Antilles, not even of the Caribbean. In his mind, he's creating, the Antilles as this group of islands from Cuba to the north, to Trinidad and Tobago to the south. It is blackness that ties us together, and what will bring us together to become the united people that we are, albeit the Western European narrative, right? But in order to tackle that division created by compartmentalization, we need to come to this core realization that although my accent might be different from that of a West Indian, and even my language is different from that of a West Indian, and there are multiple Western languages spoken in the Antilles, the story, right, of the bringing together, right, of the indigenous peoples that were in these countries violently attacked by Western Europeans, and the violent bringing of people of African descent is what actually make us this. And now I'm quoting Vasconcelos, the Mexican philosopher, makes us this cosmic race, right? So if we're going to use race as the excuse to marginalize, no problem. We will create our own, acknowledging that the violence that brought us together actually make us a more strong, a more solidarious, and a more productive and creative people, or groups of peoples, right? That should be brought together, right? And that, in history and in actuality, brings to bear beautiful projects, right? Social, economic, and political, that some are in the works, and some that never came to happen, right? But are all weaved together by the power, of the argument that violence was what brought us together, right? But it is that togetherness in our diversity that makes us a much stronger people, right?
Yeah, I think it's that incarnational piece. That's the theological underpinning, that the story of how you, Melva, came to be, or how I came to be, or how Amaury came to be, and even how Lee came to be, even you, Lee. It's not one page worthy. It's volumes and volumes about how we are who we are. And so I think that's like a really key point, that the way that white supremacy operates has very distinct and different impacts on all of us. And trying to lift that out in the book, I think that it can be very overly simplistic for people to be like, the original sin is slavery. Okay, how do you think people got to the US, and why were they brought to the US Did it have something to do with the indigenous people, maybe, and the fact that people were taking land and then didn't have the labor sufficient to farm it, and it just like needing to address all of the different ways in which we're all impacted is really a way of honoring how we are and who we are here. And I also, and you know this, Melva, of course, that a one-pager does lend itself to being misinterpreted, since clearly we have all arrived at different conclusions based on what we have read in the scripture, and that being able to dig and dig and dig at this project of American Christianity, let alone white supremacy in the US, it requires volumes as well. So here's a little corner for people to bite off.
And not only the telling of the backstory, but the telling also of how that backstory brings us here, right? One of the strengths and the future of the U.S. American church is not in its traditional institutions, but in the people that are coming in. But the people that are coming in are not people coming to then be Christianized in the American way. We make this point throughout the book. People who are coming to the U.S. are coming to the U.S. because they have heard of a dream of a country that is not, but that was told through, among other things, missionizing endeavors, right? So people who are coming already Presbyterian, already whatever tradition they are coming with this idea of what the church here is. And then they are surprised, right? That the church is not theologically or socially where they thought it would be because of how the story was told, right? So the stories that are then being brought is this, I'm going to use the term in Spanish, this criollo form of this Creole form of Presbyterianism or whatever mainline at the Christian tradition is that's coming. Well, this is also true in the Roman Catholic Church, right? Because although it was imposed on us in a very colonial way, right? The religion, it was made sense of by the people who were receiving this tradition and coming over that way in which it was made sense of, that way in which it was creolized, right? Is all of a sudden thought theologically, liturgically, and on the discipleship front, second class, right? Because the way to be a right Presbyterian, it's the way that a tall, steeple, upper middle class, mainline, whatever would be, right? So again, all those stories connect, right? You know, these are not simple byproducts of, right? This is the result of imperialism and colonization and white supremacy and everything that happened in the late 1400s and on.
And I want to be clear. And sometimes I don't know what the word is. I'm gonna just say sometimes it feels sad to have to say that. I know that there are Blacks, there are Asian Americans, there are Hispanic who have fed into the narrative of whiteness, and so I know this book is not just for white Christians; it's for everybody. But have you had any feedback or any anything that has arisen from others who are, I guess I'm thinking more so of a lot of the conversation that came out of the AAPI incidents that have happened, and some conversations between Black and Asian Americans who are like, well, now you know what it feels like. You know, are you ready to now acknowledge that you too are a product of racist systems? And there's some who said, you know, I've always supported Black Lives Matter. And how do those tensions maybe play out or are addressed in this book? Or could this book be used to start conversations like that?
Yeah, I think a lot of the intergroup tensions that do arise for people of color are because none of us are taught each other's histories, and we aren't taught our own for the most part. And so for people to be like, now you know how it feels for us, is a really ahistorical take. So that's why the book is kind of constructed in that way, that, you know, this is something that's been happening to multiple groups of people. And because people do enter this stream, right, through migration and show up and suddenly they're racialized and they have no clue what happened before they got here. And because coming to the US, you are required to want to become more American if you're going to make it, right? Like it's a requirement to have some kind of English proficiency. It's a requirement to assimilate in certain ways. It makes it a lot easier to be here and to stay here. And that also means then people who come have a very ahistorical take on particularly the histories between people in the US. And so I think to not separate out all of the groups, like we could have done that for this book, right? To say like each group has its own distinct history, because that is true. But honestly, every group has been interacting with each other, has been working with each other, has been pitted against each other by white supremacy. And being able to show some of those connections is actually a greater priority than pretending like we're all separate. Because pretending we're all separate is a white supremacist act and a way to continue to keep us divided.
And thinking that, and thinking about that, my grandmother always said it's easier to make an enemy than it is to make a friend, because you can compartmentalize, you can demonize someone very easily, but when it comes to really getting to make those connections and getting to really create relationship, not saying everybody has to be friends, but creating relationships and understanding, that is the hard part. And it seems that specifically American Christianity, white Christianity, has been simplified. And I had a discussion the other day about, and we won't talk about Christian music, but the main thing we got around from like poppy Christian music that I grew up on was that it was very individualistic, that it was a lot of I language when it was a relationship with God and you as a person. Do y'all see that as like this very individualistic way of relating to God? Do you see that connecting in this conversation any?
I think sometimes we are required, in order to feel like we have a place in this conversation about white supremacy and racial justice, to have some kind of individual trauma that we bring to the conversation, which I think is, and obviously that's a thing. People do have individual experiences of the system, obviously, but to require that be the point of entry for different people of color to engage in this conversation, or for white people to suddenly engage. Like oftentimes it's like one thing happened. It's not that they understand how the interstate system was created. And now they're like, wow, that's racist. So I think it's important for us to all be able to interpret our own individual experiences, but to remain in the individual misses the entire point of white supremacy, which is to have this positive advantage for one group at the expense of everyone else. And I think the individualistic way in which we have this kind of faith expression or theology or approach to relationship with God, it's also, it makes it harder for us to see systems, I think, broadly. I think you've really hit on something there.
One of the things that I hope I communicate well in that chapter, but I think it's also repeated I'm certain it's repeated in other chapters, is one, that individualism is a construct of white supremacy. Full stop, right? And it has been played out throughout history, right? there was a recent actually let me use Caron Nazario's situation, the lieutenant that was stopped in Virginia by Windsor, Virginia, at the cops in December. That now there's a lawsuit coming on, and it's come to the news recently, right? Caron Nazario is a Black and Latino man dressed in army uniform, stopped by cops, and all sorts of violence ensues. One of the cops is of Hispanic name, right? To not address that head on, especially within the community, right? Supports that way in which that is his individual problem and not our participation and the consequences of colonialism over our the realities, right? And also does not acknowledge the longer history of it, right? There's this very long sentence in my chapter that I'm actually surprised that Laura kept. Something to the effect that it was intentional from Western powers in the 19th century to divide what was this concerted effort that connected, right? Cuban independence from the war of restitution of the Dominican Republic with the sovereign endeavors in Haiti and talks that were going on in Caracas, Venezuela for Puerto Rican independence, right? That was all connected, right? And it was Western powers exercising their need for supremacy that divided those. And people in our lands don't know that story, right? And then we're fed up this this internal dislike, that again is artificial, right? And it was made outside of us, right? And creates that leads us to, for instance, this very difficult current situation of nationalism rising in the Dominican Republic in its relationship to Haiti, right? And this idea that Haitian independence is separate and distinct from Dominican independence, when in fact it's not. And not only is it not in the greater scheme of things, there was in the beginning of both at the sites of Hispaniola, at the seeking to be freed from its European masters, right? There was this interconnectedness, right? Even this idea of becoming a Dominican Haitian confederation, right? That was undone, not by the narrative we have been sold of internal strife, right? But because of intentional Western European intervention in it, in order to protect Western Europeans' interest in natural resources and other resources that exist still in the island of Hispaniola, right? And now it's pegging again very publicly, although that pegging has existed forever. These two countries at the one against each other, when their histories are far more intertwined than they are. And speaking of individualism and the church in that narrative, a lot of that cooperation that was happening at the beginning, for instance, between Haitian and Dominican leaders, was articulated out of the Christian faith that leaders on both at the sides of that island lived, right? Which is also very interesting, right? This wasn't a strictly political and economic project, right? It was also an ethical, theological, and religious project, right? Out of the creolization of the faith, the way they understood it in the island of Hispaniola, as an example, right? And I can say examples all throughout the Americas of how that existed and was intentionally undone for the sake of white supremacy and economic interest of the United States, Canada, and Western European countries.
I think the subtitle for this book could be "Making the Connections," because even as you're talking, it makes me think about it. How often we don't emphasize, like Nazism started with the church saying, "Go ahead, it's okay for you to oppress these individuals," and also just the again how we continue to speak about, we are connected. We are a connectional church. We are connected to the vine, and yet we still do things, or we still buy into these, like you said, separation policies. And even to relearn, even for myself, to relearn and re-engage. And I kind of simplify what Miss Griselda Lartey, Dr. Lartey from Emory University's wife would say, is like, we had religion, we had God, we had Jesus. It just didn't have the same name as the Catholic Church. And so we bought into the story of like, no, you don't. Like, let me connect you to the right God. Let me connect you to the right Christianity. And so I see now so many young people reconnecting back, even Asian American and Pacific Island, like reconnecting back to their roots and ways of family life and living, because we can't disconnect Melva here in America from Melva's ancestry, right? It is all connectional. And so I think even for white Christians, as they connect themselves, mind and body, back to spirit, it will help them to understand how all of us are connected, like you said, from history to trauma to language or language distinctions. You know, like you said, it may sound differently, but the connection is there. And so I'm excited to read a book again. Thanks, y'all.
It's all Laura's fault.
It's Laura's fault that I am in seminary. It is, yes, I'm going to tell it. I'm going to tell it. I have known Laura since I was naive and in the world and having fun. And now I am broke and in love with Jesus. Laura's fault.
I love it. Not like you come from a family that's like this or anything.
Yep. And I think that those intentionally not making and unintentionally not making those connections also removes you from being accountable. If I, in my individualistic faith and how I view the world and society, I only have to account for myself and how much I can gain and my relationship with God. That's how, in many ways, that's how I grew up in some ways. That it was me and God. And if I strayed, I'm going to piss God off and then I'm done. Not in any kind of, nothing that else was connected in a communal sense. And so, yeah, I wonder if that in the individualism also removes the accountability. And as Reformed, we always say Reformed and keeping Reformed, accountability is within that. And so, yeah, I wonder, the conversation about accountability.
Don't you think that this individualism really lends itself to an overemphasis on intent versus impact? And as an individual, I mean, of course, you don't mean to be racist. You don't mean to displace people or have unfair advantages, right? And I think, I think there are a lot of connections with that. And I also think, too, because we have a tendency, we don't know everyone, right? And segregation is a real thing. We do have a tendency to relate to each other how we have seen one another, I guess, and how a lot of us have seen one another is not in a one-on-one, even individual basis. We've seen each other through the gaze of white supremacist dominance. And because of that, then the impressions that we have of each other are very much shaped through that. And we need to be in relationship with each other at an individual level, of course, but also at a communal level in order to disrupt that very intentionally, especially since we know a lot of people don't have the privilege to do so. So I kind of think it's incumbent upon some of us to try harder because we have the capacity for it. And so it's on us to do this work since not everyone is able to.
And media's played that role as well. And that's why we started this show in some ways, is that how do we utilize something that has been a tool of white supremacy to create a distance, but also to create a narrative of the other and have control over that. And that is one of the reasons why we started this, is to not just say that, but to say we need to rethink this whole media thing.
And that also speaks to the rules of engagement set forth by white supremacy, right? There has been this not recent. It's popped up again, whether Robert's Rule of Order should be even the way our tradition organizes, in the way we engage in the governance of our church, And by no means of denomination am I advocating that we don't use it. And consensus might not be the better one either. That's a whole different conversation to have. But the reason I'm bringing that up in the context of these comments is that white supremacist culture develops engagement in which parties are brought together to try to convince the other by discourse or otherwise that their point of view is right. That's what I call dialogue, and that's what I think the word dialogue means, right? And the problem with that is that people are coming into that engagement already on an uneven ground, right? Because politically, economically, and socially, there are already people set over others, right? And the truth is that this whole principle of the rule of the majority, period, right, is an exercising violence and core to the way Presbyterians govern themselves in the United States, right? And again, and I'll say this, and I mean it, and I mean it. It is violent, the way we govern ourselves in that way. On the flip side, and I think this book models it in written form, bringing people together to bring themselves, right? I wasn't invited to be representative of the Hispanic community or the immigrant community or of the colonized community, right? I was brought in as a subject of those identities, right? To bring some ideas to bear and to share them into this space, that is this book now, right? So that we can have conversations with each other out of our own experiences that are our truths, right? And if we would shift our rules of engagement from dialogue, trying to impose one idea over the other, to conversation, which in Spanish shares the root of the word convivir, which doesn't have a translation in English, but it means to live together, right? If we would only come together with our truths to live together, right? A byproduct of it will be spaces of convergence, right? But the reason we're coming together is simply because we are called to be community together, right? So the byproduct of convergence then leads us to do stuff together, or to confess things together, or to right wrongs that we need to do together. But we came together simply because we are a community and called to be that, right? And I'll stop there.
And this doesn't happen very often, but we have a question in the comments. So, and we have a little bit of time. So I'm going to ask this question. In the conclusion of the book, there is talk of sincere confession needed from the church. Can you elaborate on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think this has something to do with this conversation, reconciliation versus reparations, right? And this also, I think that chapter may have been written before the Confession of Belhar was adopted, which I don't know if you know, but that was the easier way out. It was to adopt Belhar as opposed to write something that is contemporary and addresses our current realities. Although obviously I think Belhar still stands. It's still great and very helpful. I think it's a question of whether the church is like, hey, sorry about that. That was rough, what we did. Or if the church is capable of saying, there has been so much violence that has shaped this world because of the theology we gave, and the theological cover we gave, and then the socialization we gave, and our participation in imperialism. Because, and I think we've alluded to it, Melva and Amaury especially, but like how people experience US military intervention in other lands is part and parcel of how racism and white supremacy operate within the US. Like everything that we do domestically has an international component or role. In order to fully confess, we have a lot of telling to do because, as you know, a lot of people really don't know anything. And there is so much to know. Like I learned about the connections between Haitian, Dominican, and Cuban struggles for independence along with Puerto Rico and from Amaury. And I read about this stuff all the time. So there's always more to know. And some of it is that truth telling. But then some of it from the church is how do you make something right that has ruined millions of lives and is currently ending our way of life on this earth as we know it because of our violence toward creation and our violence toward other people. So I think that deep confession, it's so much, right? That deserves a few books as well. But to call the church towards that, I think it's like, it's one of those on-ramps to having very serious conversations about what it is to confess the damage that was done and then begin to repair, because we can't bring anyone back. You know, we can't undo some of that, but we can always try to do it a little bit better next time and at least tell the truth.
So we are at that time. Any final comments, last thoughts? I had a question, but I'll let you guys go if not. So I was kind of thinking, we were talking about connection, and I'm glad that question about confession came up. What is maybe another takeaway from the book that outside of people going out and reading the book can kind of say what would be the next kind of steps as a collective church that we need to do to really respond to this crisis? Amaury?
I know. Amaury, don't you think telling the truth is a part of it? I feel like that's sometimes all we do, but telling the truth over and over again. And because we're always learning new manifestations of it, like the author of basically the digital chapter about the internet, Tahina Rush, she's so good at telling the truth. But in ways that like, I didn't think of all of that digital stuff. I was like, hey, can you please write this chapter? And then she just did such a masterful job of it. I think that's some of it.
And to me, the thing is that we as an institutional church are not telling the truth and don't want to tell it because we know institutionally that once we open that gate, there's going to be a flood, right? The Presbyterian Church USA and mainline white Christianity in the United States knows the power of speaking that truth, especially after the Black Lives Matter movement and a little bit before that, the Me Too movement, right? It's not that women hadn't been spoken before that, right? But there was this right moment in history by this right person in the right place that finally cracked what women had been hammering for decades, right? It's not that Black folks in the United States hadn't organized before, right? But there was this other moment in history more recently that finally cracked another wall that led this floodgate, right? The church does not want to be ready to simply say the truth, but to respond to the consequences of that truth, right? Because it won't be what happened in the Confession of 67, where on top of our ivory tower, we said, oh, these are things that society is doing, right? What I think Sarah in her question is saying, and this book begins to say, is like, no. If we're going to really open that gate, right, we actually need to follow the example of the church in South Africa and say, we did these things. And we are responsible for them. We are responsible for Manifest Destiny. We are responsible for the iteration in the United States of the Doctrine of Discovery. We are responsible for colonialism. We are responsible for U.S. Military expansion throughout the world. We are responsible, and it has Presbyterian written all over it, right? And institutionally, we're not ready to be there yet.
But I also think institutionally speaking and theologically speaking, we underestimate what it is to be a resurrection people. I don't know why, but like we think of ourselves as so fragile, which is so interesting to me because we follow a savior who literally was executed. And I don't know why that's so hard for the church. You know what I mean? So I think that sometimes it's easy for me because I'm not serving in a congregational setting to be like, ugh, the church. But at the same time, we have the capacity to do this because that's the kind of God that we worship. We just have to suck it up, get it done.
I need to reiterate that, that we need to do these things because we know, especially folks who are marginalized, that there is always good news, that accompanies this struggle, pain, and marginalization. Yes.
Amen. Mm-hmm. Take up the cross.
Get it done.
Get it done. Thank you so much. Again, I mean, seriously, I do have a book that I want to read now. And I do blame Laura. Not you yet, Amaury. Let me meet you one more time, and then I'll blame you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
It was good to be here indeed. Yep.
Yeah, this could go another hour.
Yeah, maybe we'll do a number 2, part 2, sometime in the summer.
Yeah,
bring you back. But yeah, thank y'all so much for being here. For everybody listening, thank y'all for listening. This will be up for you to hear later. It'll be up on Unbound's social media on Twitter and YouTube and Facebook. It's kind of everywhere. You can't really miss it. You can watch it anytime. And we may even start putting these recordings on a podcast to make them even more accessible. So, so again, thank you to our guests. We really appreciate and are blessed by your presence. And next week, y'all can catch us here at the same time. And Mel will be back with us, hopefully.
Prayerfully. I get my second shot.
Yes, and we never know the reaction.
Never know.
So hopefully Mel will be here, and we'll be talking about immigration next week. So join us next week, and until then, we'll see you next time.